So for this video, we're going to be looking at tearing down and putting back together the upper for the Kriss Defiance. Obviously, my handguard isn't standard, but the process is basically the same. I've got non-standard dust cover, but again, process to replace is the same. So, to get us started, we need to separate the upper and the lower. And for those who don't know, the way you do that is by pushing up your takedown pins, and then your upper and lower will just cleanly separate. And we can put the lower to one side, and that leaves us with the upper. So the next thing that we're going to do is remove the bolt and the charging handle, and we do that by just pulling the charging handle, sorry, sliding out the bolt, and sliding out our charging handle. And this is a non-standard charging handle. This is Strike Industries latchless charging handle, because I'm left-handed, and finding a Radian Raptor or a Geisley is incredibly difficult. So instead I opted for the latchless Strike Industries, and then bought the additional tabs that extend the reach of the charging handle so that it's easier to actuate when you're using a scope, or it's just easier to actuate in general actually. Okay, so we'll break this down in a few different steps. I'll detail strip the bolt and show you how to replace the key parts that you're likely to need to replace for that. I will show you how to remove the dust cover and the handguard. I'll do the bolt second, so we'll start with the dust cover and handguard. To remove the dust cover, life will be much easier for you, and you won't risk marring your finish if you just take the handguard off first, because this retaining pin has to come out either that way or that way, and it doesn't bend. So if you try coming out the back way, you're going to be fighting against the receiver itself to try and remove it. So we'll start by removing the handguard. The Kriss handguard, so this was an LVOA to start with, and that was held in place by just 2 screws on the bottom that you release and slide off, and that's all there was to it. This handguard that I got from CMMG firearms is non-branded. It's a company that they're working with because CMMG are working to release their own line of AR rifles, both in straight pull and 22 rimfire. So they're having them made by a company specifically to their specifications, and that's where I managed to get this. To buy it and to have it installed by Ralph over at CMMG, £75, which is really good value. It's a solid handguard. I'm pretty sure it's 70-75 aluminium. It's just non-branded, so it didn't come with the premium price. And to attach the handguard, I'd had some problems with my Kriss, where it was just on very tightly, but it turned out that actually you just needed to give it a bit more welly than I'd been willing to give it, because I didn't want to break it, and I didn't have the experience in removing them. But yeah, it was no match for Ralph and a large wrench. So once you've taken the retaining screws out, it will just slide off, and it will get stuck on all of your M-lock rails that you've added. Yeah, and then you will see that every handguard has an individual nut that comes with it. The Kriss Defiance nut held in place just by pressure. The barrel nut held in place by pressure from the screws, whereas as you can see with this one, the screws that go through the handguard are actually screwing into specific dedicated holes in the barrel nut, so that's providing an extra level of stability and security so that you know that handguard isn't going to move anyway. So that's the handguard removed and tactfully placed to one side. So next will be to remove the dust cover, and what I have just noticed is that the barrel nut is actually at a height where it is blocking the dust cover retaining pin from removing. So I think we're going to have to go out the back way anyway. And this is a job for a flathead screwdriver. Okay, so you have your clip, and it's a C-clip that holds this pin in place, and it rests in a recess in the pin itself. And to remove it, you just have to give it a bit of a push, and it will pop off. And then you have to be very careful not to lose it. So once that's out, the pin will then start to slide, and the problem that you will then encounter is that the pin will hit the receiver and get stuck. It's quite hard to do this in a way that's camera friendly. So the only way that I've found to get the dust covers to come off cleanly is to remove the pin in full. However, because this is a shorter dust cover, you can get away with just sliding that off that way. There you go, you can just hear that scraping. So you can work around it if you have the flex in your dust cover to be able to pull this off of the retaining pin without having to remove it entirely. As you can see, that is a tight fit, and you will end up marring the finish. If someone knows a better way of getting these off, I am all ears. But yeah, because I've managed to remove that, I'm not going to push it any further and take off the finish. So what you'll see, this is the CMMG dust cover, specifically designed for 22 rimfire, and its main purpose is to provide additional protection from all of the hot gas and bits of dirt that come flying out. So particularly if you're left-handed, you'll find that in a low wind or shooting indoors, that hot gas will just hit you clean in the face. Not every time, but enough for it to be a nuisance. And I've bought this and I've tested it both at a covered range and just standing outdoors and just emptying entire magazines, and it completely removed the issue. I was still experiencing the odd brass strike on my arm, but I think that was due to a worn out extractor, which I've now replaced but haven't had an opportunity to test. So fingers crossed that will then resolve the issue, but it won't unfortunately resolve the issue of being a lefty. Now if we look at the actual receiver itself, 22 rimfires come in, they manage having a 22 rimfire barrel in different ways. So the Kriss one has got this barrel adapter that sits on the inside, and it brings the barrel forward, and it means that it fits nicely against their CMMG style bolt. When you look at the CMMG bolts, there are different variants of it, but they tend to have this covering is part of the bolt, and it comes forward and it has a larger hole in it, and the barrel itself just sticks through a lot thinner. It's more akin to, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see, but the silver portion of the barrel that you can see inside there, that tends to be all there is. So that additional portion of the barrel just sits over the end, the additional portion of the bolt sits over the end of the barrel, so then when it is reciprocating, it's picking up the cartridges and feeding them into that additional part of the bolt, which is passing them into the barrel. Whereas with the Kriss, the bolt isn't doing that. There is a feeding lip that's part of this barrel extension that sits in the upper receiver. And really that's it for what you would want to do to the upper receiver. You can remove and replace the forward assist with a roll pin. I don't know what, unless it actually broke, I don't know what the particular benefits of that would be, but it's nice to have options, I suppose. Make sure I don't lose that C-clip. Okay, so the bolt itself is actually held together very simply. You have a small Allen screw here, which through the bottom is what stops the bolt from flying off the end. And then you just have a guide rod with a spring, and then the actual bolt carrier itself. So if I start by taking the bolt off the rail, just simply unscrewing that, and then easing that off the rail, and then you have your bolt spring, and your bolt guide, and then the rail itself, and then you can deep clean that should you need to. Inside the bolt itself, you've got your extractor, and you've got your firing pin. There is also a cross pin that fits in the top here, which is what holds the spring in place as it's sliding along and working across the guide, and it stops it from protruding over through that cross pin. But there's no real reason to take that cross pin out unless it's broken. So we will just focus on taking out the firing pin and the extractor, as these are the parts that you're likely to change. As I say, I've replaced my extractor now after a year, and 8,500 rounds through it, which from what I understand is a reasonable volume of ammunition fired to require a replacement extractor. Obviously 22 isn't as hot as 223, but you know, I work it quite hard. Normally in a session I'll shoot 400 to 600 rounds. Yeah, so it's not had an easy life so far. So to remove that, all you were doing is removing the pin from the top all the way down, and there is a hole for it to feed out from the bottom of the bolt. So make sure that you go top to bottom, and with that pin removed, the extractor just lifts out, and then you have a small spring here. The replacement extractor that I've got is from Firearms, and they also, so you can either just buy a replacement extractor. They also offer a replacement spring, so similar to the bolt catch spring, it's an adjusted spring. I think this one has slightly higher tension to ensure that the extractor can work efficiently and that you're getting that solid extraction and ejection. So that should resolve the issues that I've been having with regards to brass landing and burning me. So to remove the firing pin, again, it's just another pin that you can just push through with a punch. It's not being held in place by any great tension, and then the pin will just drop out the back. So this is a aftermarket titanium firing pin that the person who had the gun before me bought. Whilst that firing pin is still working perfectly fine, I did take the opportunity to buy a secondary firing pin from Firearms, just so I've got it should I need it. And there's very mild difference, but yeah, nothing to write home about. But yeah, that current firing pin is still working perfectly well for me. But it's just good to have spares on hand. I've also got a spare firing pin spring. So should the firing pin ever start playing up and it turns out it's the spring, then I can replace that without burning through a new firing pin unnecessarily. And that is it for the bolt. Other than that, it's just a nice solid piece of metal. So in comparison to taking apart the lower, the upper is relatively simple. I'll show you how to put it all back together now, and yeah, that's all there is to it. So we'll start with the firing pin. Be aware the firing pin has a cutout in it. I'm not sure if you can see that. That cutout needs to be facing upwards, and the pin that holds the firing pin in place uses that cutout to stop it from over travelling. So if you haven't got the firing pin lined up in the right place, you won't be able to put your firing pin retaining pin back in. But you'll see that if you just push it around, you'll see that that just slotted in there. Now, there's no exact science to how far to put it back in. Just make sure that it's recessed what seems like a sensible amount on this side, and it's not sticking out too far that side, so that you know that it's securely in place and that it's not just going to shake out, and that your firing pin has the movement it needs to clear and strike the cartridges. So then the next thing is to return the extractor. So spring first, and then the extractor goes in just following the pattern of the bolt, so it has that cut out, so make sure that that matches, and then it's just a matter of ensuring that the hole for the retaining pin in the extractor is lined up with the holes to extract the retaining pin, and that once it's in place you can just move it and it's solid and it's not going to shake loose. To then put the bolt carrier group back together, the guide rod just gets slid back into place. The spring then goes back into place, and the spring and guide rod are then fed into that runner at the top of the bolt, and you'll see on the sides of the bolt there are recesses for the frame forks to run through, and then you're just holding that back, taking your retention screw and just screwing that back into place. The top of the retention screw should be flush, but not too tight. If you don't have the retention screw incorrectly, the bolt won't travel properly in the receiver. It will get stuck. It will be quite obvious that something's wrong, because the bolt won't close fully when you've put the rifle back together. But yeah, the best way to avoid having to play around with it is just to tighten it enough so that the retention screw in the frame is flush with the top, and is low enough down that it solidly retains the bolt from moving off of the frame. Okay, next we put the dust guard, or dust cover rather, that I failed to take off properly, put that back on. With the CMMG piece, it has a spring that it uses for spring tension against the receiver. So you just need to make sure that you push that down nice and flat and feed that over the retaining pin. The spring for the actual dust cover itself, and this is the same with all dust cover springs, you need to make sure that this is twisted in such a way that it is providing opposite force to hold the dust cover in place. That can be done after it is slid onto the retaining pin. Just going to push that back a bit to get a bit more. There we go. So you have the small end of the spring pointing upwards, touching the receiver, and then the large end will be pushing against the dust cover itself. And then we're just knocking that pin back into place with a bit of force. It's not a change that I'd recommend making often, bear with me. So once you knock that through, you need it far enough through that the recess for the C grip is protruding, so that you'll be able to then reattach the C grip. And then it's just a matter of pushing the C grip home. Like that. And then I just try and move that pin to make sure that the C grip is definitely in place and is holding it securely, and that flicked open and closed. Lovely, so that dust cover is functioning correctly. And then we slide our really lightweight handguard back into place, negotiating all of the screws that we added for our M-lock pieces. Oh, and just what I was saying earlier about the receiver not being 100% mil-spec, you can see where some of the edges had to be shaved down just to get that to fit into the recesses properly and make that a nice snug and secure fit. Screw our handguard back into place. Again, this is another fine point for a musical interlude. Nip those all up later. So, when replacing the bolt and the charging handle, place the charging handle first, and you'll see on your charging handle that it has these extrusions, and they match up with indentations inside the rail at the top of the upper receiver, and they hold the charging handle in place. Once the charging handle is in, then you just line up the bolt, he says, line up the bolt, and then both pieces just slide home into place, like so. And then, to ensure that you've definitely put everything back together in the correct way, reattach it to your handguard and just function check it. And to avoid damaging the firing pin, you can just do the hammer check with the bolt still slightly pulled back. And that's that. So that is the top of the Kriss Defiance, the upper receiver of the Kriss Defiance, fully stripped down, with the exception of the barrel, but as I said, not a gunsmith, so I'll leave the barrel alone.